My definition on regenerative is a practice or an outcome that does more good, that is compassionate, that has care at the kind of heart and soul of it, and that it's also looking at these kind of wider opportunities to give back to a planet from which we have taken far too much, but also to take care of people at the same time.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. Hello, great to be back with another episode with Scott McAulay, who is Regenerative Design and Infrastructure Specialist at the architecture studio Architype. Scott joined me on two previous episodes, all the way back in episode 31, and then more recently for episode 100. Links to those episodes are in the episode description if you want to check those out afterwards. But today's episode is all about regenerative design. And as you'll have heard from Scott's job title, that's something that he's very much focused on now in his job at Architype. We're going to hear about what regenerative design means to him in practice, how it goes beyond the typical more technical definitions of that, of being about, reducing emissions below net zero carbon or water use and biodiversity, which are all very important, but how regenerative design is also about process, about how you work with clients, about how you impact local economies, how your schemes are related to social justice and a just transition. It's a huge, big conversation that we get into today all around this, and I really enjoyed it. You'll have heard a little clip right at the start, before the introduction, of Scott talking about what regenerative design means to him. So that comes up in the episode and we get into more detail on that. Let's get straight into the conversation. Really hope you enjoyed this chat with Scott. Tell us who you are, what you do, and just those sort of basic stuff, and then we want to jump a little bit more into the work you're doing.
Okay, so my name's Scott. I'm a regenerative design and infrastructure specialist with Architype, and that role is very much, it begins on a base of kind of technical expertise and specialism, so material studies, circular economy, regenerative resource propositions, life cycle analysis, lots of the kind of the gubbins that make projects that bit better, looking at the wider data, but also the kind of the communication part. But a really key part of that role is not just the design and supporting teams across our projects, but it's really about cultivating conducive infrastructures for delivering regenerative design. So the social, the economic, the cultural, and the environmental. It's that full kind of four wider pillars of sustainability. I've also got a background in kind of education. I've done a lot of work for the Anthropocene Architecture School, where I've taught a few kind of between 7,000 and 8,000 people internationally. Last year, had work kind of published in 4 different books, and I did some work with the Architecture Fringe in Scotland. So I co-produce events, work on kind of cultural programming, and I do all sorts of little bits and pieces around the built environment and just kind of wider advocacy for a just transition and that in wider society.
Excellent, good introduction. Let's talk a bit about your current role with Archetype. How did that job come about? It's a very different sort of job title to anything most people would have heard of before.
Oh, absolutely. So when it came to developing the job, infrastructures was very much from my own kind of personal perspective. But to kind of give that wider trajectory and journey, I joined Archetype back in 2021 under a kind of part 2 architectural assistant, but predominantly focusing on sustainability coordination. I helped develop the practices climate action roadmap. I did kind of support on material strategies and wider sustainability targets for quite large projects. And it was sort of looking at the wider upskilling as well. So that was a big part of me joining the company. I was bringing my background and kind of the expertise and passion that I've got and being given space for that to kind of grow and flourish. And kind of over the kind of past, I moved into the role about 7-8 months ago, and the kind of 6 months before that, we're kind of in conversations about longer term futures and what direction is the industry going in. Things like circular economy and regenerative design were very much kind of forefront of the industry's conversations. And I've been kind of working around regenerative practice within and beyond Archetype for quite some time, been kind of introduced to it several years prior. And in developing that role, it couldn't simply be another sustainability specialist. It couldn't just be you just do the fine tuning of buildings. I came at it and we co-developed the role. It wasn't simply I had an idea and it was kind of ticked and crossed. It was very much we looked at how the wider operations of Archetype work. So in Archetype, we do not have a sustainability team or one point of contact whose responsibility is to carry sustainability. That's something that all of our co-owners know, that from day one, your part of your job day to day is pushing the boundaries of building performance. Kind of for 40 years, Archetype have extended the horizons of sustainability and shown what's possible through buildings, setting some kind of benchmarks that have held their own, like the Enterprise Centre, for 10 years solid. And so in developing that role, it was how do we support our teams with this expertise that I have in a targeted way that's not so much joining the dots, but is operating within the space between different teams, but also working on projects. So I do life cycle analysis. I've worked quite a lot on EnerFit informed retrofit plans, looking at the carbon impacts and the operational carbon usage of non-domestic buildings 60 years into the future, depending on what level of retrofit you take them to, from case 1, doing nothing, what is that impact, to case 5, 6, 7, what does a full EnerFit look like? So in developing that role, it was kind of looking at how do you create the time to identify emergent possibilities across projects to have regenerative impacts. So because I was hired and came in to work across studio, I came in 2021. It was hybrids. Most of our teams were online, starting to go into the studios in the kind of year and a bit afterwards. And I was working on all sorts of different projects, from carbon calculations to looking at wider sustainability goals and just how far can you push them. So I was in quite an anomaly and a unique position where I knew lots of the people who had done what, who had the expertise, what project this had been pushed on before. So I was able to sort of weave together different responses, but not just weave together responses, but I could take a step back and say there's two things happening simultaneously across projects. If I was to spend 1 hour on this project, I would actually be spending 1 hour on that project, developing and nourishing the same thing. So from a purely efficiencies perspective, it was about stepping back, fine-tuning, optimizing, but it's also about acting on emergent opportunities. So I also do kind of communications, upskilling, and really like relationship building, and even public events. I've done parts of how we've engaged with our kind of local community and the industry around us in Edinburgh. So it's very much a role that encompasses many, many, many things. There's that basis in kind of the sustainability delivery on projects, that coordination, that life cycle analysis, that material expertise. My background's in natural building, hempcrete, straw bale, clay. They're some of my favourite things in the world. But it was about how do you bring this into project and identifying sort of the same way you would talk about a retrofit trigger point. Like at what point can you, as you initiate the retrofit of building, I got very good at identifying points for really raising the bar through an invitation with clients. So this is something you want to do, or this is something you want to learn. This can actually go so much further. Like what you want to do is amazing. And by doing that, you've actually unlocked the possibility of doing this additional sustainability thing as well. So my favorite, the way that I teach and the way that I bring it back to when I'm talking to our teams, the circular economy is a portal concept. It's something that through the circular economy, we can start to talk about regenerative design, we can start to talk about resources, global justice, the just transition, resource scarcity. Through that one, what had become a buzzword, I can open up conversations on just about any aspect of a sustainability brief, and we can weave them back, and we can use the education on the circular economy to actually expand those horizons into regenerative design. So lots of what I'm doing is lots of it is on emergence. It's very much on what's happening where. I do quite a bit of project time where I'm not doing what you'd explicitly call regenerative design, calculating life cycle analysis, kind of carbon, whole life carbon, is part of getting there, but it wouldn't say it's the be all and end all. But I'm in this role that's kind of quite focused on emergence. It's looking for those opportunities. It's stepping back and mapping. I've been sort of charting our climate literacy in the project since I joined year by year. So I'm also identifying where our co-owners have kind of gaps to learn or additional things we could bring in through CPD. But it's not a head of sustainability role by any stretch of the imagination. I am not responsible for all of our projects in that circumstance. What I do is I am someone that any project team can approach if something comes up that's materials have become available. Is there any projects we could use them on, as one example? Or we're beginning this new school project and we'd really like to talk about the wider possibilities based on what we've done before, what we've done elsewhere. Or it might be my favourite one, my niche is becoming agricultural college campuses. We're doing some refurbishment and new build and looking at new build for an agricultural college. Can you look at possible opportunities that could be regenerative for that project in that locale? And I bring my kind of background in materials. I've got a really good wider picture of what's been going on in construction through my work with the Robson Architecture School, the Architect Climate Action Network. I've got to meet so many people. So when it comes to, we're doing a project here, I'm like, great, I will open up a conversation with a friend I have down there and we'll see, like, do you have any idea of like what materials are going on? Is there anything we should be aware of? And it's just this, it's very much been a role I've been growing into. It does have a scope. It has been written down to say this is what your job is, but it's growing into those opportunities in a way that has not really been done before, and it's exciting because of that. Because I'm approaching projects in the way of imagining how regenerative can this be, and that's very much my job on the project. I come out, how regenerative can this be? What opportunities are there? Are we doing anything else at the same time that overlaps with that? It's complementary. Or are we doing something that if we taught it to the wider industry, how would that have a big impact? Like, just kind of, how do we share and kind of disseminate learnings to do beyond the current curve of sustainability architecture? But I could talk about it at quite great length. It is a real joy. And it was something that I'm very grateful that Archetype decided, let's take the risk. Let's give Scott some space to experiment and let's see what we can do through projects with. And it's already having kind of cascading effects across projects.
It is an interesting theme I've noticed across interviewing lots of people who are in sustainability or regenerative roles. I think it's happening more and more now that roles are created and then advertised and people apply for them. But I think still to this point, there's a lot of really important roles within practices that are just sort of invented by people that are working there or co-created with someone. And I think it's kind of career advice I give to people of saying, you know, there's so many people who are like top of the game in terms of sustainability who do not have a degree related to sustainability, but they've just learned all this stuff on the job, and then they've been very tenacious about like applying it, talking to their colleagues, talking to their collaborators and their clients, and trying to push forward with it, and then like learning and iterating in practice. Has that been kind of the case for you as well?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that I don't really use much of what I was really taught in my degree. The sustainability-wise, I very much went to look elsewhere. And in practice, I've always, I've realized I love to learn. So I'm always kind of looking to expand my own sort of understanding. And natural materials and regenerative design became a real kind of passion and keen interest for me. And when I came into the practice, it was very much, that was celebrated. That was when I interviewed, my opening kind of thing on here's the projects I've worked on. My favorite. I did my first ever construction site was a hempcrete chalet in the French Alps, and I opened with this, and I was like, I get excited about these things. I'm not going to be ashamed of it. I'm just going to be very forthright. And I got asked in that job interview, like, how do you feel about learning? Like, would you be up for learning about this specific thing about life cycle analysis? I'm like, that just sounds really cool. Yeah. Like, I've seen things about that and I would love to understand it. And it really kind of grew from there because I was doing other things at the same time. So initially, when I started, I was on a 3-day week. That's what my ideal circumstance was. And I said, I'm doing lots of ad hoc, eclectic teaching and stuff. And because it was the kind of that sustainability piece, which is the kind of carbon consultancy, that wasn't always going to be coming in the door with a consistency that passive house schools are, for example. So that worked really well. And then as I kind of really settled in and felt at home, I was like, I really want to push more. And after my kind of initial, I had a strange thing for me that will surprise people. I felt I had to be polite for 6 months, and I shouldn't rock the boat too much, and I should say things but not just push overtly. And after that, and I felt comfortable, and I've been encouraged. I was always being encouraged. Kind of, are there things that could this go more? Have you? In presenting this, has this been made more kind of palatable, and I was always encouraged. At no point did anyone say that's too much. Stop it. It was very much you've started on this thing. Like, where else can this go? And I was really just encouraged to show up as myself fully, and just like, here is what I care very, very loudly and very overtly and openly, and that was encouraged. And the kind of iterative learning, and there's a real culture and archetype of passing on learning and nourishing the learning of kind of younger co-owners. And if there's ever a project where I've been working on, and say, I've seen this has been done elsewhere, and if I reach out to the project architect and say, can we grab like a hour-long chat? Can you teach me how you did that? Can you talk me through that project? And that was always welcomed. So there was always a kind of that dissemination of knowledge and passing on was always there. And then that got kind of incorporated, before I even took on the regenerative design part, that was incorporated into my role, where I would be doing the support for like less experienced co-owners starting to learn about life cycle analysis. So I would be, say we're looking at 6 schools, I'd be crunching carbon numbers on 3 of them, I'd be supporting people on 2 to 3 others. And that's really built into the ethos and the culture of, learning, and we're iterating and we're sharing. But also after every project, we're going to sit down and say, what did we learn from that? And how can we improve it next time? But I definitely think that's the advice I give to students is show what you're passionate about. Instead of show them what you think they want to see. That's 19th, 20th century ideas of mold yourself into the job that you don't understand yet. It's go in and show them what excites you and what you're interested in. And that went down really well. And kind of co-designing the role, we were going back and forth, and it was sort of not just like what's the remit, but how does this operate and how does it sit alongside project time? And we kind of were looking at one of the kind of experiments is that on a Monday, so kind of like 25% of my week at the moment, I work a 4-day week, going to go up sooner or later. on a Monday, that's my regenerative design and infrastructures resourcing capacity. If any architect, any kind of assistant, any engineer, anyone wants to grab me on that day, everyone knows that's a day you can just grab Scott. Or if something is going to come up later in the week, I can reallocate that resource to that opportunity later in the week, and I will take the project time into the Monday. So very malleably, I can look at a week and say, I'm going to do wider strategy. This thing is coming up, so I'm going to put some time to that. But it also means that we're seeing like how much time can go on to this, will go on to this, but we're experimenting and iterating. So this is kind of iteration 1 is, what is the outcome of me being given 25% of my time to be on regenerative outcomes and this kind of identifying of opportunities across our work, and 75% on kind of projects that are still likely doing regenerative design, but are more kind of project focused and are focused on that one sort of piece of work. And that's been incredible because like one lovely example was a colleague stopped by my desk when I was through in the studio and said, I've just been told by a friend in a practice in London that there are lots of materials going for free through this material platform. Are there any projects that we currently have where we can use them? They don't know how long the window of time is. Is that now part of your job? I kind of stopped and went, Well, I'm going to say yes,
Why
because
not?
why not? Like, it's not something that's kind of architecture school 101. How do you relocate materials from London to somewhere else in the UK? But it was because we had that, and because I've got that role, it's sort of like it gives everyone that bit of permission to say this is something that could be really, it could push the boundaries, but I don't have time at the moment, and my team is a bit stretched. Where else can we, like, does this actually sync up with something else we're doing? So I've been looking at lots of circular economy. So another project we're looking at a building, I was like, right, why don't I sync up our CPD so that you can bring in the project team and we can all learn about this potential thing together, and we can actually turn it into sort of like a nourishing this relationship with the design team. And that's something else I've got kind of scope to do within the role, is to kind of look at these things and say, this would be a great thing to do. Or we've had the CPD from a deconstruction contractor, like, let's keep that conversation going. Like, we learned a huge amount from the people doing the practical disassembly of buildings.
Yeah.
That's something that we definitely need to recognise and celebrate and build upon by doing more. That it might not be projects, it might be events, it might be roundtables, but how do we keep on nourishing these possibilities? And by having that time where people know, right, there's a bank of time where if it suddenly comes up, we'd like to like benchmark the carbon on an ongoing project. We know that that there might be a possibility to do that, and if we can't do it this week, maybe next week or the week after. And we know that there's that kind of sort of I can't think of I'll think of an analogy for it eventually, probably after the episode. But you've got that resource to tap into. It's not free. The resource is freed up because I've always got something to do. There's always something going on, or something we can be developing or iterating or learning from, or refining our own internal systems so that I can improving our systems so that I can have that wider view of syncing up opportunities and time and resource and efficiencies at the same time as looking at what's going on around us as well. So it's very different than, I did start to look at the Part 3 for architecture about a year and a half ago. I looked at it and I did some of the reflections, and I was wondering, I was like, this doesn't quite feel like me. This role, like the work that I'm doing, is very, very difficult to retrofit into what people want an architect to be in the 20th century.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it sounds like me doing a couple of years ago, making a start on the Rural Town Planning Institute accreditation, and I was like, sort of going through it and just being like, I'm not a proper planner, and I probably don't ever really want to be. So why am I doing this? And I just gave up on it. Probably, it's good to do these things for your career, but at the same time, you have to just decide what your path is and what I think the careers are moving into such new territory now. The sort of, as you said, the 19th, 20th century ideas of what our professions feel very outdated sometimes.
Yeah, that was a big part. Kind of a wider part of the having infrastructures in the role was very, very intentional, because also we wanted to open up a conversation in the industry beyond just trying to deliver regenerative outcomes through design thinking, and also recognizing through that sort of phrasing and that approach that it's incredibly difficult in today's current systems with the infrastructure we have, with the policies we have, the regulations, even the cultural assumptions on what certain types of buildings are, to deliver regenerative outcomes and to actually kind of practice regenerative design. So it's it's looking at recognizing the wider space in which we operate in, and recognizing that it's a collaborative effort that we are part of. And that kind of the infrastructure piece can be looked at from kind of cultural infrastructure, social infrastructure, energy infrastructure. It can be looking at it from all sorts of different directions, but it's absolutely not the kind of architect as master builder and sole genius who moves the world by themselves, supposedly, without giving credit to all their technicians and team. Yes, but it's very much a kind of working with that, because that's kind of how I found myself working in similar ways and connecting people and opportunities outside of practice, where I'd be introducing people, I would be kind of supporting projects that had a need that was specific that they sort of assumed and guessed, like, oh, you've done all these things, you can definitely do it. I'd look at it and say, actually, it's outside of like architecture, but I can do it. This is something I can do. Like, this is if we're going to have regenerative buildings and architecture and a regenerative industry, we need the infrastructure that's going to make it work.
Yeah.
And it is going to be about having hard conversations about the kind of assumed traditions and cultures and outcomes of buildings and what goes into buildings. And it's also another point, the political piece, that in advocacy politically, it's not just about declarations and open letters. There's a fantastic thing in Scotland, the Scottish Passive House equivalent. And at Architype, we very vocally got behind this because recognising that I also talk about Passive House as a portal concept. Because if you want to deliver a Passive House building, you have to approach it very rigorously. There's already a methodology that you can grow outwards from. And it's recognised, it resonates with people. It also has evidence that shows it works for decades, and you can fine-tune it through building performance evaluation. So through Passive House, you can talk about building performance evaluation. But as you start to look at energy and you start to look at comfort, you can then expand into materials and carbon. And you've got this great starting piece for incredible architecture. And for a lot of people, it's become divisive because as soon as you have something where people are kind of championing it and pushing it, and if it's changing and bucking a trend, it's going to get kickback. But through the Scottish Passive House equivalent, that could revolutionise all new housing in Scotland. Passive House housing, in terms of heat demand, is about 5 to 6 times less than building regulations.
Yeah.
And so kind of another part of that advocacy is recognising that regenerative design is not just about drawing a circle of regenerative design and staying inside it and saying, this is what we need and that's it. It's about the porosity and looking outwards and the plurality, but also the engagement with how the industry is working and that advocacy and that taking part, that those invitations, the collaborations, and also those, like, I think the invitations are probably some of the biggest parts. I recently did a piece of work on regenerative resource recommendations, so looking at kind of circular economy opportunities. And in simply looking at what you could do whilst taking down buildings, it really excited the client. The client really wants the net. They then said, like, okay, that's great. Can we now do more about this? And the question I'm asked quite often from people, even I've done quite a while, is your job profitable? And it completely blows my mind that we're talking about something like regenerative design. We're looking at doing more good for the planet. We're looking at social justice and creating a just space for people. We're looking at having a just transition to a greener future. And there is still this one question of, is this job making money to sustain itself? And I think it really is a real signal that as an industry we need to stop for a moment and ask some really deep questions in an industry that is totally dependent on endlessly speculatively building new buildings. Can it continue in its current form? And the rhetorical answer to that is, within a finite planet, absolutely not. But what I've found is as you start to look at the co-benefits, the opportunities, the possibilities on delivering regenerative outcomes for people through buildings, I'm not just going to say regenerative architecture and pretend that that's the be-all and end-all. I've given a lecture to two universities twice, so it's looking at regenerative architecture, the exemplary and the everyday. So looking at the retrofit of schools, looking at the places we spend our time, as much as that zero carbon school that demonstrates things are incredible. And as an industry, we really need to start having those conversations, but also we need to recognise that regenerative outcomes within today's infrastructure and systems are going to be duplicated struggle, until we effect changes on those systems. And that's the kind of the infrastructure part is grounding us in that reality. But also, it's also identifying the absolutely dreamlike scale of the opportunities available to us as well.
Can we cycle back a bit? And I might just edit this back in at the beginning for people who missed our previous chat. Your definition of regenerative design and how that infrastructure piece fits in with it. And maybe give us a bit of background on like how that term has been evolving and how you're using it, which might be different. I think would be really helpful for people.
Yeah, pleasure. So my kind of definition on regenerative is a practice or an outcome that does more good, that is compassionate, that has care at the kind of heart and soul of it, and that it's also looking at these kind of wider opportunities to give back to a planet from which we have taken far too much, but also to take care of people at the same time. So it's very much grounds in that. I fully recognise for a lot of people that it's about kind of energy performance and materials, but it also is about that. It's not just about the material you choose, but to me it's also about where that material comes from and how the land is stewarded, about the nature of the transaction and the activities along that supply chain. So that's my kind of definition of regenerative and sort of quite short. But looking at the infrastructural piece, in terms of infrastructure, the infrastructure we currently operate within is degenerative. We have a construction industry that's entirely dependent upon endlessly building new buildings and is heavily reliant upon fossil fuels, on speculation, and things like gentrification being normalised. And the infrastructural piece that I look at is looking not just at the building scale. So when I'm looking at a project, I'm looking at the project, but I'm also looking at beyond the boundary of that sort of site. I'm looking at what is possible from how we source materials, the material that we use, and I kind of opening up opportunities for doing more of that. So with clients, if I'm doing reporting on carbon, I'm doing recommendations on materials at the same time. If I'm looking at kind of aspirations on targets, I'm always showing examples. So as much as I'm kind of communicating, I'm always extending invitations towards what is regenerative. If I'm showing you what the whole life carbon is of your building, I'm also showing you what's possible in terms of doing better. Not in terms of saying you've not done well, but in terms of saying, we've shown this as possible. Would you like to give that a go? And the infrastructural piece is also it's recognising that lots of solutions that might be great on paper in terms of carbon might not be great in terms of impacts on the land or the impacts on people. And there's lots of different ways of looking at that. And it's about it's recognising that if we want to deliver sustainable outcomes through the built environment, we need to be politically engaged. We need to be engaging with culture. We need to be learning with and from people. We also need to be unlearning quite a lot. But it's quite a big piece. And I've had moments in time before starting the role where when you get hit by the scale of our infrastructure as a physical entity, it is absolutely mind-blowing. But when you start to look at it as a space for opportunities in terms of what are the benefits of us adapting our built environment for a changing climate in such a way that it creates jobs for generations, because retrofit's not a one-off. If we have a regenerative built environment, there's going to be stewardship, there's going to be maintenance cycles. And lots of that sounds very technical and probably not what people have talked about in terms of regenerative design that often in architecture, but it is looking at that wider stewardship of land and landscapes and our position in our local communities and the global community as well, if that kind of gives a bit more of a grounding.
I think what's interesting, reflecting on what I'm hearing, is there's very little of what you said which is about the technical aspects of it. And I think, as you mentioned, regenerative design is often talked about as being beyond net zero carbon, beyond zero water use or zero biodiversity impact. It's sort of ticking over on those technical aspects into a net positive impact. But what I find, and in that sense, it becomes a bit we can get down into a lot of scrutiny and being like, is this really a regenerative project, or is it just slightly, is it just more sustainable or whatever? Which I think there's a place for that. But what I'm hearing from you is it's much more about process and intention, like your intentionality in terms of moving practices in a more regenerative way.
Absolutely. Like for me, it's on a personal journey. I got into sustainability through the heavily technical, so materials, building physics. Like that was my bread and butter. Like that was what I understood. Applying this to buildings, looking at the building performance, looking at the amount of carbon you could sequester in a building. Very much looking at, if we're going to build, we should definitely build from this because this is great. But for me, it's been a process of unlearning, where it's not just been about, we've got all these solutions, just throw every single thing, like throw all the Smarties and hope some of them stick. It's very much been a kind of realizing that we have the capability to do this. So for me, an incredible point of learning is a book called Ecominimalism, The Antidote to Eco-bling by Howard Liddell. And Howard founded and ran Gaia Architects in Scotland, and I've been incredibly fortunate to learn from lots of people that passed through his practice. He has sadly passed away, but his influence on practice was massive. But in reading this book, it was very much a case of, I was going through it and was like, wait a minute, this is decades plus ahead of its time.
Yeah.
We've already got, we could be delivering benign, non-toxic buildings. We could be doing super low energy. We could be designing with the landscape. And this is not just in sort of like, and then when we look to kind of more, all sorts of different kind of cultures and how they respond to their landscape, we can do this in so many incredible ways beyond the Western ideology and canon of architecture that you don't get taught about thoroughly enough. And it was in reading this book, and then sort of I read FutuRestorative by Martin Brown, looking at the Living Building Challenge, and really digging into the idea of the regenerative. And what really jumped out to me for that one book was that 40% of all the money any country spends on healthcare is directly because of its built environment.
Wow.
And that absolutely blew my mind. And then there was also alongside the 40% of carbon emissions come from the built environment, kind of 40 to 50. And I was like, if we understand this in our current paradigm and we are not responding to it, this is not a design problem. This is not a lack of tools. This is a cultural piece. This is a systemic and political problem that we have the technology and the knowledge and the wisdom and the means, but we're not applying it. And that's what became my kind of, how do you bring that up in process? And very much as process and principles. What I refer back to very often is I put just transition principles at the core of my work. That's the idea of the process that takes us to a decarbonised, regenerative society is redistributing power and wealth, and it's taking care of people. It might be phasing out industries that are degenerative, but it's shifting and creating opportunities in regenerative ones. And it's the Climate Justice Alliance definitions it's about the process of how we get there as much as the destination. And I've just found that through the different activities I've done up and down the UK, kind of projects to events to teaching, the Retrofit Reimagined Festival, looking at all the things we know how to do, but we're not doing them. And we're watching kind of on our current trajectories, the construction sector for the UK and EU 27, it's blowing its carbon budget next year. And this didn't make a headline in the industry. This was very much kind of like, not even a whisper, not even a kind of like, there was no hint of it at any form of architectural press. I'd quote it all the time. I kind of, just as this is where we are, that our context is that we have used up our fair share by sometime in 2026. And it's very much you can look at those technical aspects, like you looking at the kind of the impacts, like you can get incredibly granular with carbon. You can go down to the exact location of where something is sourced from. Or you can look at the processes as well, and how is every project that we do another iteration upon our work for us to be able to do more regenerative things next time. So even if we don't get to do a living building challenge project every single time, which would be a dream to be able to say to local authorities, everything we do, this is feasible within our current paradigm. But yeah, that incredibly frustrating truth is, at the moment, the systems we are working within are not going to let us deliver regenerative outcomes without struggle. And that's something that I'm not seeing spoken about enough within the industry. It's very much become a bit of a buzzword, and it's an incredible call to arms. Like it is to say, we need to do more good with our work. Fantastic. I'm 150% on board. But I'm also on board with being grounded in reality of the space that we work in and just being honest with that. Because if we don't engage beyond our practices, there's only so far you can go within that paradigm, within the available resources, within the budget of a client, within the resources you're able to allocate to a project, within the resources available, kind of full stop. And I'm really hoping to open up that wider discussion with this regenerative design and infrastructures piece. Like, it's the wider conversation, but it is, I am going to be talking at an event in Edinburgh next month about data and how we show it. And I'm pretty good with graphs. Like, I'm very happy talking about them. Like, yes, we do need those. There's a place for those. But there's also such a need to consider our process.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I love that. And I think from what you've said, it seems like it is a framing and a terminology that gets people excited and motivated to do things more so than the typical sustainability approach of being very, I don't know. I think environmentalism in general, I feel like the environmentalist dream is to just cease existing, because then we'll have zero impact on the environment. But that's just, what we need to be thinking is a much more like, reframing human activity in a way that it can coexist and have positive impacts. And, I think about all the ripple effects that built environment projects have on the surrounding communities, on the clients, on the users, can be much more than just reducing the impacts or having as little impact as possible. It needs to be like rippling out into positive ripples. Do you find that as well, that like you're seeing those ripples happen with the projects you're involved in?
Yeah, I'm even just to take and kind of flip. I would say the environmentalist dream is definitely to come back into kind of balance and equilibrium rather than non-existence. I would kind of rally against and say, I would say the environmentalist dream is equilibrium of the natural world. And I saw an incredible piece yesterday, someone mentioning that biodiversity is infrastructure, and that blew my mind. It's like our natural world is already this incredibly intelligent, unique infrastructure. But to come back to the question, I keep tangenting off, but it's when I talked about regenerative resource propositions, there was a lot of excitement, because this was, again, for open kind of transparency, when I'm preparing this for projects, I am not always the person who is thrown at the client to be like, look, that one person talks about regenerative outcomes. No, I sat with the project team and I talked them through it, and we had conversations back and forth, and they were the people that took it. So that one, I may have done the groundwork, but the delivery and the conversations were had by a project team who were looking to push. And there was an excitement. And when on another project, we had a client and they wanted their project to be a circular economy exemplar, and they wanted it to be regenerative. And we said, right, like what is your current understanding of the circular economy? And he said, we're going to be honest, not great. I'm like, tell you what, Scott's done quite a bit of teaching and has done a circular economy workshop in-house before. Would you like to do that? So I took our circular economy workshop and redesigned it so it became half me explaining and half our client weaving the circular economy learning back into their sustainability visions. So instead of me just coming in and throwing numbers and stats and graphs and cool buildings and nice pictures, I was like, right, it's now participatory, it's interactive. And they got the hardest part of that workshop was deciphering the handwriting. That is how excited people can get, and it's incredible. And it was my kind of like suggestion on the team. I was like, I know you want me to do like explanations, but I would love to actually like talk to the client about this piece as well. So not just where we think things are going, but I'd love to take that extra time and to look at that. And they got really excited. And it was a total joy. And also there are quite fun moments of things like that when I'm in the sort of room, things like that happen, and the colleague kind of looks and goes like, this is different. Like, this is, I wasn't expecting that part. And when you said participatory, I didn't think you were going to give everyone pens. But it's lots of it's about facilitation, and it's about holding space. So an example of a role that an architectural studio can play that's regenerative is sort of, there was a kind of fringe festival going on in Edinburgh, and we looked at it and went, what could we do that would engage people locally on different scales? And I got asked, like, if you could choose 3 things off the top of your head, we know you probably have a couple ideas, what would they be? I'm like, fantastic, I do have 3. Number 1 was looking at kind of whole life carbon alongside engineers, so with people we'd collaborated with. Another one was looking at whole estate-wide decarbonisation and retrofit within the kind of local authority and the kind of community and like institutional scales. But then we did a just transition town hall. So we probably did the most antithesis of architect thing of all time. We did not give a presentation. We were not a panelist. We were the hosts. So we hosted the local tenants union branches, the local council adaptation team, a charity on retrofit, and some practitioners, the Yala Impacts, who are looking at regenerative practice with kind of community design. And we had this incredible kind of like town hall event saying what was happening in the local community about the just transition of our built environment. And we had kind of people came in from all different kind of backgrounds and interests, from the kind of, I'm an architect and it's interesting, to I live a couple of streets away and I didn't know this was here. And we created a space for conversations that could not have happened otherwise. And there was such a buzzing excitement. And I got asked afterwards, Scott, was it your full intention to put the council in the same conversation as a tenants union on that one particular subject? Because if yes, that was genius. And I'd be like, subconsciously, yes. Thank you very much. But it's the process. And we created the space and we held the infrastructure for things to happen that could not have happened otherwise, that were about that regenerative shift. And you can take it even wider. You can look at a wider scale. An example that I know kind of hit me very recently all at once is, if you're going to start to look at scale, at what does a regenerative construction sector looks like in the context of a just transition, what would that practically look like? So when we're looking, the example I'm going to go for is timber and construction, because it's very important that we use more natural materials and we sequester carbon, but it's about the output and the technology and the sort of the process we use. So if you look at timber, and if we were to say, right, we want to build as much as possible from timber, and let's just, the 19th and 20th century thinking is, right, we centralise the infrastructure. We go in for cross-laminated timber above everything else. We have one central hub. Everything comes into there, we send it out. That would be 20th century thinking, that we just immediately say, we know that this does the job. We've seen it in practice. It does great things. I'm advocating for it before anyone gets angry. I do not think it's a bad thing. It's a good technology. But if we were to say, right, that's going to create it's going to create centralised jobs. It's going to be quite a vulnerable supply chain in terms of climate change. But if we were to say, right, what does a regenerative infrastructure look like that uses timber across the UK? So if we actually look to examples like Plumber's Wood by Gaia Architects, and by the visitor centre that Architype did for the Welsh Forestry, you can use a technology called Brechdapple. Brechdapple is phenomenal. It's an engineered mass timber technology that doesn't use glue. You build up lamina or layers of timber, and you use timber dowels into it to kind of naturally join it. And as it naturally expands, it interlocks and it becomes one mass piece. This technology can use softwood timber that we have in greater abundance, that doesn't take as long to grow, and it does not need a mass centralized infrastructure. It could be deployed in most kind of joinery, carpentry, wood-like kind of timber mills. It could be deployed in flying factories on the Scottish Islands where supply chains are quite hard to use. In terms of creating jobs, you could be training people who have existing experience in joinery or in timber framing, and expanding their skill set so that when they're not doing timber framing, they could be doing this. Or you could be going into construction colleges and teaching a skill that can be taught in a construction college, in a workshop, on a small scale, and teaching people how to build this technology that can be dispersed and distributed, the kind of donut economics idea, design for distribution. That, looking at it that way, if we said, right, we're going to look at meeting our housing demand by dispersing our production of engineered timber, by using this technology rather than centralizing it. And in terms of a just transition, that's going to disperse the jobs. It's going to in terms of supply chain, it's not going to be as long. You can reduce the emissions in the supply chain. You're not using the glues that cross-laminated timber requires. That's a regenerative outcome. That's if we were to say, right, how do we approach an industry using a material? It's not the only way. There will be circumstances, say on the non-domestic scale, where cross-laminated timber is absolutely the go-to. But if we were to think about housing on domestic scale, that's what a regenerative infrastructure could look like. And it's about, we're not going to move in that direction if we don't pause and have the conversations and make the time to actually look at how our industry is working today. Yeah. Because in terms of planetary boundaries, in terms of social and kind of climate justice, spatial justice, it is not working for everyone. And there's an incredible example from the Enterprise Centre that I saw before I joined Architype, and it's now one that I use in teaching. It's what I use when I'm talking about materials. For the Enterprise Centre, there was a mapping exercise was carried out to see what are the locally abundant materials. Everything from kind of reeds to chalk to earth, but not just the materials, the skills. Where can we go to learn about this, or who can we go to carry out this work? And that's what led to the kind of incredibly distinctive and familiar thatched cladding that was developed with master thatchers in Norfolk. And that technology would not have been deployed if there hadn't been a pause and a consideration of what exists in the local area and economy, and how do we nourish that with what we're doing. And yes, the building has performed beyond the industry kind of ideas of what buildings can do for 10 years solid. It turns 10 this year, which is going to be a fantastic occasion. But it does all the things on paper in terms of the numbers. But when it comes to what it did in terms of materials, that's regenerative, and that's really exciting. Well, it's exciting for me. I love materials are one of my favourite things. I will get excited about them for decades. But if we just keep doing what we're doing and then put the carbon lens on it and say, right, what within our current ideas of technology and distribution and infrastructural centralization / decentralization, what is the best thing for this? Because I do not think the solution is every country having one centralized cross-laminated timber factory and going in for kind of plantations of forestry. No, I think that the alternative to that is to be supporting agroforestry projects and local skills through the dispersal of a decentralized infrastructure that uses timber differently. And that's the wider piece that could be so exciting and could really change lives. We could be taking the industry to new places. We could be going to places that were left behind by deindustrialization in the kind of 70s, 80s and 90s, and bringing industries that meet their housing needs, that also take care of them without using materials that are bad for their health. And without that process, and without giving people the space to imagine that different industry, we're not going to get there. And the part of my job and my role where I have that resource time to look at strategy. So I'm working on the strategy, but whilst I'm looking on strategy, I sort of get background tasks in my head as I think. As I'm working, I'm always kind of adding to my own I keep a list of regenerative materials or approaches or different ways of using things. And it's always kind of building up that resource that when someone says, right, we've got a client who's very interested in using timber differently, they'll be like, right, I have 7 different ways. 5 of them are cladding, 2 of them are engineered timber, and all of them can be done in ways that could be very exciting. Rather than just saying, right, we're going to have a head of sustainability whose job is to do project reviews and occasionally write a report for us. It's creating the space and the time to imagine the industry otherwise and to identify the emergent possibilities in the work that we do by nourishing regenerative processes.
It's so interesting. I mean, it really gets my mind thinking about how the world's going to change in the coming decades. And I think, there are people talking about the inevitable relocalization and regionalization of economies as we basically the kind of how hyper-connected and globalized the world is now really only possible because of oil, more or less, and having a sort of centralized energy system that is very easily transportable. As we, oil is in an inevitable decline, whether it's, in time to prevent dangerous climate change or not. But by the end of the century, there's going to be a lot less fossil fuel in our energy system. Energy systems towards renewable energy will become much more localized just because that's in their nature. And it's interesting to think about how our resources, materials might become relocalized as well as part of that. One of the things I read recently was in the sort of medieval and late medieval period in Europe, most European cities had a very well stewarded forest surrounding the city because it was a resource that people were going into to get building supplies, timber, firewood, foraging, hunting animals. It was this hyper local, source of resource, and people managed it over centuries in a sustainable way. Now, we did also hunt beavers and wolves to extinction and lynx and all that. But, if we think about how we could do it slightly differently, coexisting with these other animals, there's an interesting model there for how our sort of resource flows for cities are so globalized and so stretched out. And if it's inevitable that they become more relocalized, does that mean us really rethinking the kind of materials that we're growing and stewarding, in our local area? And, on your next architecture project, you're not necessarily going to crack that, but it's like thinking about the way the world is going and how our projects fit in is really fascinating.
Yeah, on that kind of note as well, from kind of personal experience and just kind of reflection, the way we talk about the circular economy, if we change that could be a portal concept, not just for project level change, but that could be infrastructure level change. Because the way that I teach it, and I was very fortunate that I had the opportunity, and I was explaining the circular economy to an agricultural college. And I'm very fortunate to have a friend who's an agroforester. So, and in speaking about it, it's like, this is natural in farming. Just do not go for any of the kind of overcomplicated technological. Talk about inputs and outputs, and immediately click. It was just... But also, when we're talking about a circular economy, I think we need to be very, very careful, because there's the idea that we just talk about resource flows, and that completely not just dehumanizes, but it takes the life out of those ideas.
Yeah.
So sort of the way that I like to explain it is the circular economy in construction is not just about resource flows, it's about reconnecting construction to agriculture and forestry in reciprocal relationships. And that's it's looking at where materials come from, but also how is that land stewarded. And if we're going to relocalize materials, it's not just about timber; it's about earth and about kind of earthen materials. And I've had clients get excited because when they wanted to use earthen materials, And I said, okay, can we test the clay on site? And if it's a go, all of the excavations we have to do, we're going to keep and make our own clay plaster. And they're like, we can do that. I was like, oh, this will be fun. But it's getting... Another thing is like the experience of materials is transformative. So to see regeneratively sourced materials in practice is very, 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 very different than watching a webinar series. So if we rewind to about 6 years ago, before the Anthropos and Architecture School started, before I worked for Architype, I was a student and I was incredibly interested in learning about materials. It wasn't in my kind of course. I was going outside of the course to look for opportunities to build, but I came across the Scottish Ecological Design Association, and that kind of, the enthusiasm it wasn't just encouraged, it was nourished to the point that when I said, I'd love to learn about this, the response from someone was a really throwaway comment of, have you ever thought of pulling together an event about it? I was like, no. Actually, no, never done that. So through the kind of Architecture and Design Scotland had a materials library at the Lighthouse in Glasgow. So the Lighthouse is this Charles Rennie Mackintosh building. It was Scotland's Centre for Architecture and Design until it sadly was closed. But through CEDA and in collaboration with Architecture and Design Scotland's materials library, over 2 years, I pulled together and hosted 2 material seminars. So one was on straw bale construction, one was on earth. During the straw bale construction one, there's an architect and now good friend who's, I'll name drop him for fun because he's been a very great inspiration. So Sam Foster gave this talk about the piggery, which was a house built from straw bales. And in the design process, he took the clients to experience what it was like to be in buildings built from these materials. And that had a really transformative effect on their ideas of what they wanted their house to be built from. So if we then come back to 2024, the last year, and we're looking at Archetype, we're supporting Civic Square, looking at their public square demonstrator. And when we were kind of looking at what these materials, what are the possibilities, my proposition was we need to visit the Enterprise Centre and the Utopia building so we can see a retrofit in the terms of what you want, but also so you can experience what it's like to be in a space that's surrounded and built from and made from these materials. And the joy from people, and you see it, and it's not just like this is a photograph, but you can actually see the difference in people and the curiosity and the difference in how people respond to a space. And another kind of concept I've used in my teaching, but also now use in kind of taking clients to places, is you turn that into a classroom. That building, that site, everywhere becomes a learning resource, a classroom. So you can, through taking our clients and their neighbours to the Enterprise Centre, we demonstrated not just the materials, we talked about climatic design and future adaptation and reusing materials and testing materials. And we use the building to just talk through that. And I think if architects were to do that more and to make it a very normal thing, to take your clients to buildings where you've demonstrated this before and to be make a day of it. This is not just a get in and get out, keep it to 2 hours, get everyone back at the office fast as you can, but take the time to really experience that. Because I think for a lot of people, we talk about passive house a lot. I'd say most people in the UK have not experienced what it's like to be inside a passive house building. Yeah. There's a noticeable difference. So if we're going to disrupt the processes of how they are, an incredibly powerful tool could be a tour. Yeah. And it's not radical. It's so playful. It's so soft. It's a soft skill. It's taking people to let them experience that possible future. And I think in that relocalization of our infrastructure, looking at energy as well, through construction, we can reduce the necessary size of substations to speed up that energy transition through high building performance. And that's possible. That's being done. It's being demonstrated that can be done. And I think that if we simply look at buildings and don't engage in the wider conversation on infrastructure, we've got kind of solutions to problems that would go unresolved otherwise. And if the imaginary says we have to entirely replace the energy demand that we use under fossil fuels with renewables, that's an incredibly tough uphill struggle. But if we say, no, it's not going to happen. But if we say that, if we instigate like society-wide demand reduction through our buildings and retrofits and new builds, and through we reduce the size of the infrastructure we need to replace, we have a lighter impact. We need to use less resources. We need to generate less. The maths is very, very simple, and it's it's that the infrastructural piece where, again, my job doesn't sit within traditional architect boundaries, because these are discussions that I'm talking for. I do some work supporting fuel poverty campaigners as well, and I talk about the potential role of the built environment alongside energy policy, not in isolation, but as complementary pieces.
I'm enjoying this conversation immensely. We're over an hour, so I'm going to ask: is there anything else we want to touch on before we wrap up? Is there anything we sort of missed?
Not off the top of my head. I don't think we have, but I would also just like to say that thank you very, very, very much again for the opportunity to delve into this, because I mean, the more time that we take as an industry to have these conversations, and the difficult ones, as much as the exciting ones, as much as the ones where it's really exciting to show off the new material, but also the ones that saying, we tried this on a project and it didn't work. And I think the more safe spaces that we have to iterate together and to kind of collaborate and share, that's going to make the difference, I think. It has to be, we do need to look at regenerative design on an infrastructural level, because in isolation, it is incredibly difficult to do regenerative design. There is no part of the natural world that developed in isolation. We look at that wider planetary system, it was co-evolution, co-evolving, co-benefits. We look at, I think, as a final sort of ending piece, if we go back to the kind of the imaginary in forestry a few decades ago, was that in forest and woodland, trees must be in competition with one another. Like, they must be. But as we look back, we're seeing the indigenous knowledges that told us the natural world was interconnected in reciprocal, beneficial relationships is actually true. And it was the cultural imaginary of neoliberal capitalism, effectively, has changed how we look at fundamentally everything. And there's going to be a lot of unlearning, but the possibilities in doing that unlearning and having these conversations, in creating roles like mine that are very different and on paper sound a bit ad hoc, and it can be a one-pager, but the more time that we do this, and if we just recognise that we cannot, as designers, deliver regenerative design alone, and that's something that I would like to extend as an invitation. It's not a criticism in any way, shape or form. It's just that if we look out at the wider systems in the world, we are always going to duplicate struggle until we change that wider infrastructure. And I invite everyone to have those conversations with your colleagues, have them with your friends, have them with your clients and your boss, just across sector. Those are the ones we need to be having, and it's about process as much or as more so than the technology and the materials at play.
That's great. That is awesome. That's such a good point to end on. Thank you, Scott. I'm going to make a little book recommendation in case. I know you're a reader like me. If you haven't read Eco-Responsive Environments, I did an interview with two of the authors a couple of months ago, and I'm working behind the scenes with them on something that I'll announce soon, or maybe we'll have announced by the time this comes out. But for people who are working more at the master plan urban design level, that's such a great book to look at a bigger systemic perspective. They talk a lot about working interdisciplinarily, and the way that we, settlements sit within a wider ecological system, the kind of things that you don't get taught in school, more or less. So yeah, I love that one as well. And I'm going to check out the books you recommended.
Oh, as well, there's one that I would absolutely recommend, just as a sort of to build off of the environmentalist kind of point earlier. Incredible book called The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables from a Planet in Crisis by Amitav Ghosh. And I would thoroughly recommend that everyone reads it and passes it on. It was very emergent because it was on my list of something that I needed to read. And I went down to do a project in our Hereford studio, and a colleague had just out of nowhere said, I read this book and I thought you might enjoy it on the train ride home, and it might be something that will resonate with you. And it's probably the first book I've read on a train where it's probably been visible to people around me. I've just been so shocked, and I've learned so much, and my horizon has just kind of extended. And things I had heard before were put onto even more clear context and really unpacked in a way that I think all of us really need to sit with about decolonisation and the colonial roots of the climate crisis. That's a book that I definitely think is absolutely fundamental reading, because it will extend your horizons in an incredibly healthy way. And it's something that I think that in terms of book recommendations, it just kind of shot straight to the top of mine.
Yeah, that's the power of a good book, and hopefully a good podcast for some people. It puts into words things that are maybe floating around in your head that you haven't connected together yet, and gives you clarity and says, oh, that's what that is. So yeah, super helpful. Thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate it. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
If you want to find out more about kind of the work that I'm doing with Architype, you can go onto our website. And if you want to find out about my work kind of broadly, you can look at Instagram for the Anthropocene Architecture School. You can also find Architype there. You can also find the Architecture Fringe there. As part of the Architecture Fringe, which is between the 6th and 22nd of June, there's a kind of international open call currently open. So if anyone wants to do something anywhere in the world relating to reciprocity, which is our provocation this year, that would be fantastic. And there's also the ways to end on books. There's the Anthropocene Architecture School Library on Instagram, which signposts people towards a huge amount of resources, but not just books, also listening and watching material, because everyone learns a little bit differently, and it's good to have some kind of diversity in there as well.